So, what exactly do you mean when you say, what do you mean?
I do not understand this. This really confuses me.
What's that supposed to mean?
Literally.
What's that supposed to mean?
What's that supposed to mean?
I don't know what you're talking about.
What are you talking about?
What's that supposed to mean?
Cultural anthropologist Ujwal R. Kalgood and Motive-Base president Jason Partridge will tell you that perception and meaning are the primary pressure points that shape and create the world we live in.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word.
Let's explore why meaning matters.
I don't think it means what you think it means.
Now, here's your host, Aaron Trafford.
All right, welcome back to episode 2. This is Why Meaning Matters. And just to give you a little frame of reference, if you have not yet listened to episode 1, first of all, you should go listen to episode 1. But we set up the conversation talking about how meaning has changed at both the individual level and the cultural level. And the whole backdrop really was this quote by Bill Gates where he said, "We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that occurs in the next 10. So last episode, we talked about where we were 10 years ago. And now what we want to do is look ahead a decade from now. Because what I think is really clear to all of us is that the pandemic, what's been going on in American politics, has caused a bit of a fever pitch in terms of a pivot point culturally. So I want to really dig into, first of all, exploring how do we know we're at a pivot point, A, and B, what should we be looking to understand what's shifting for the next 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a 100-year-old model that comes out of structural anthropology and structuralism from the early 1900s that states that ideas usually develop as myths in culture. And they're myths because there's not enough people who believe them yet. But somehow, for whatever reason, some of these myths, they turn into truths over time. And they turn into truths because more and more people agree. They achieve consensus on what that thing means in culture. So, if you take a topic like social cohesion, and we're doing a lot of research on this, looking at the American social contract. If you take a topic like the social cohesion, in America, in particular, in American education, the idea that America is great, that everything is possible is always taught, and it might be changing now, but it's sort of been a central theme in American culture. Because of that, the idea that social cohesion could somehow perhaps be broken is something that was not even acknowledged, despite all the inequities that have existed in American culture, especially for the Black community and people of color and women. But now suddenly there's an acknowledgement of that. But at the moment, this notion that social cohesion is broken is still in myth stage. That is, it doesn't have mainstream relevancy yet. But what we can see is that there is greater consensus coming on this topic. That is, it's bringing more and more people in. More and more people are agreeing on the fact that social cohesion is broken and on why that might be the case. This model from myth to truth, very, very interesting. And meaning allows us to track and measure this.
So let's actually bring that down to ground level. Like, what does that look like, that transition from myth to meaning to truth? Do you have a concrete example that we can understand as non-anthropologists, non-digital anthropologist people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's take the rise of populism, right?
Okay.
And let's look at let's say the last 10 years and rise of populism, not just in the United States, but globally, we've seen this. There are certain myths that turned into truths. So one of that is the lack of trust and faith in any form of institution. Doesn't matter whether it's the government, doesn't matter whether it's, publicly funded entity, whether it's the hospital network, whether it's corporations, a complete lack of faith and trust in the purpose and that these institutions serve, right? And certainly Trump did a phenomenal job, and kudos to him for that, of leveraging that. And what his campaign did was, for one way or another, they realized that this was on the cusp of becoming a truth. And they took it and ran with it, right? He came as the outsider, all that narrative of being an outsider and, trying to change the system and blowing up the system and all of that. I think that was very well put together because somebody there understood that there was greater consensus on the idea that people can't trust anybody.
Well, and I think that the timing was immaculate as well, because, in our previous episode, we were talking about how meaning takes time to shape itself and behavior can change overnight, but meaning is a long-term game, if you will. And I think that, even in the last episode, we were referencing the financial crisis in 2008. That was a cultural neutron bomb. That was a huge change in the American landscape where the US was made to feel vulnerable in a way it hadn't been made to feel before. And all of a sudden, there was this question in and around what is the future going to look like? Now, there was the immediate short-term implications of that, which we all saw and we all experienced. But long-term, what that really started to do is it started to basically make a lot of people question American exceptionalism. And that laid the groundwork, or sowed the seeds, if you will, for a narrative where somebody could come in and say, trust me, I am that outsider. I'm going to be able to fix this.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, tell me if I'm wrong. From the average American perspective, back in 2008, all of a sudden, everything we believed, quote unquote, to be true, collapsed in front of us. Our neighbors lost our homes. A lot of people lost their jobs. The American dream was very quickly tarnished in a short amount of time. Mm-hmm. So you're saying that what really happened is in that 10-year span, somebody like the Trumps of the world were able to capitalize on that shift in meaning and ride a wave upward rather than fighting against it. So here's a question I have. Is that in any way like pandering to the lowest common denominator? Like, is there how do we find a redeeming way to do that?
Yeah, and Erin, I'm going to put this in the context of the COVID vaccine, right? An uptake in the COVID vaccine, because I think that's a great example. Everybody understands this. When you look at what is going on, one of the major meanings, one of the major myths around the vaccine was a lack of trust of anybody, right? Lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in big pharma, lack of trust. And then there's so many reasons for it as well, right? Including the fact that, there were CEOs of these pharmaceutical companies cashing in, selling their stock the day the vaccine was announced, right? This is just one incident of many that makes people distrust all these institutions. Now you put that into the context of the COVID vaccine, a myth develops. Don't trust this. Somebody is trying to fool you. You're the idiot if you trust this. Now, the thing is, it was a myth because small groups of people believed it. Today, it's not a myth. It is in our universe, it is what we call a truth, because there are more than 40 million Americans that believe this. That's no longer the lowest common denominator. That is no longer just somebody who's uneducated. It is no longer somebody who's, maybe into, some crazy theories about the way the world works. This is roping in people that are educated. It is roping in people who have some amount of pragmatism in their approach to life. And I think that's the scary part that a lot of organizations don't understand.
The funny thing is that we're all afraid of the other in some form or facet because we're locked into our own perspective. We're locked into our own philosophy. We're locked into our own understanding. One of the hardest things that Ujwal and I have to do is reminding people that if you don't empathize and you don't understand the emotional underpinnings of why somebody believes what they believe and why they're attracted to certain meanings compared to other meanings, then you're already kind of, getting off on the wrong foot. Because the problem is that if we don't have that empathy for how somebody has been led to a particular decision that they're making, we're not walking in their shoes. We're not understanding how we are able to reach out and connect with them. That's important from a political standpoint. It's important from a consumer standpoint.
So if there's a fear here, because you've both referenced that this is a scary thing to be on the other side of the myth, if you are not flowing with the myth, how do we get over that? Because I'm sensing that, with the leaders who emerged in the last 10 years, there was an element of courage there. And I think from corporate America, retail, all of these companies that are looking to how are we going to grow in this new environment, there's got to be some element of courage there to bridge that gap.
100%. I think the point you just made is brilliant, because here's the one thing that people don't realize. When something is in myth stage, it can be adjusted. The narrative can be adjusted. But if you don't have courage and you sit there waiting and going, maybe it won't uptake, eventually it achieves the position of a truth, and then there's very little you can do. All you can do is comply with the requirements of the truth. You have to figure out which truth you can play with, and that's it. You have to comply. And I think this is why the courage conversation is actually a critical one. I have a great story, without naming them because we're not allowed to, but, fantastic American retailer that is fighting and succeeding against Amazon with an incredible strategy, right? One of the projects we have done consistently for them is around gender, the future of gender, future of sexuality. And they've had the courage to take that research and make changes in how they think about hiring practices, in how they think about offering basic services like, having a gender-neutral bathroom in the retail locations, how they approach, training internally. So there's a lot of positive things that come out of learning what myths are developing, and then figuring out whether we have the courage, to your point, Aaron, to actually build on these and maybe mold them in a way that works for us.
Everything that you just said, there's so much there that I want to ask you about. The concept of gender and the shifting meanings of gender. I think we're at another pivot point there. So why don't I want to do a whole show about that, because I want to talk about dismantling the myths. I want to talk about social cohesion a little bit more. And I think I want to understand the whole concept of, the individual and how we play into these myths as masculine, feminine. What does that even mean anymore, right? I feel like that's the topic of this whole show. What does this even mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I think more so than ever before, I jokingly say this because with my partner, I go through at least, one scenario a day where I go, no, that's not what I meant. And I always say this to people just to remind them that, meaning is 70% implied. So if you don't think about meaning, and if you haven't thought about it, just put it in the context of your own day-to-day life. How many times do you find yourself saying, that's not what I meant?
Yeah.
And suddenly you'll see why it's relevant. Yeah.
No kidding. All right. Well, we'd love to hear from you if you're enjoying the show. Please drop us an email with your comments or questions, hello@storystudionetwork.com. And of course, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to this show. We will be back next week with lots more on why meaning matters.
Thanks for listening to Why Meaning Matters with Ujwal Arkulgud, Jason Partridge, and your host, Aaron Trafford.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Why Meaning Matters is produced for Motive Base and the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.